Reform or die. Keir Starmer sounds like he's penning the new title for the new James Bond film.
First, though, some breaking news this evening. The dire state of the NHS has been laid bare in a rapid review by independent peer Lord Darcy, who has described the health service as in serious trouble. Well, Matthew Thompson joins me from the Department of Health. Weeks it's taken to carry out this review and ahead of a speech by Sir Keir Starmer tomorrow. So what have you learnt, Matthew?
Well, you say dire. I mean, dire is almost putting it mildly. This is a devastating assessment of the state of the NHS, frankly, which the report says is failing on its most important promises to the British people. So on waiting lists, on A&E, on cancer and cardiac services, on access to GPs, on maternity services. I mean, the list goes on. It describes crumbling buildings, outdated machinery, outdated systems. It describes exhausted and disengaged staff. And, you know, it frankly ultimately concludes that the NHS is, in the words of the report, in a critical condition. But it does offer some prospect for fixing it. It's not entirely doom and gloom in its 140 or so pages, although mostly so. And I think its conclusions are likely to dominate politics, certainly until we break for recess on Friday, and probably long beyond that. You mentioned Keir Starmer is going to give a speech tomorrow in which he says that the NHS must now reform or die. So pretty strong words. And the report offers some explanations for why the NHS is in the state that it's in. The aftershocks of the pandemic, perhaps an obvious one, but it's also highly critical of the structural reforms undertaken by the coalition government after 2012. And it also is critical of austerity, the lack of capital investment over that same time frame. And it concludes that Britain is effectively a sicker nation than it was a decade or so ago, and that's put extra stress on the NHS whilst it's trying to deal with all of those other challenges. Now, Keir Starmer tomorrow will, unsurprisingly, put the blame squarely on the Conservatives, as he's done so many times over the last few weeks and months, but he will say that he has a choice: either raise taxes on working people to fix it, which he's not prepared to do, or reform and modernise the NHS. And Labour, he says, or will say, are working on a 10-year strategy to do just that.
Hey everybody, the NHS is at a crossroads. It either reforms or collapses, according to Prime Minister Keir Starmer's response to a recent report that describes the health service as being in a critical condition. No one will be surprised by this, as the NHS's ability to provide care has dramatically declined over the past 14 years. For example, before the Conservatives took office, there were about 2.5 million people on the NHS waiting list. Today, that number has skyrocketed to a 7.5 million. Starmer's strong stance is that reform is essential to save the NHS as he prepares to deliver a speech addressing the issue. The report, authored by independent peer Lord Darcy, I'll let you guys think about how to pronounce that name, paints a grim picture of the NHS's struggles. It highlights serious shortcomings in key areas such as waiting lists, A&E services, cancer and cardiac care, GP access and maternity services. The report also details crumbling infrastructure, outdated equipment and disengaged, exhausted staff. Overall, but all this should be a motif, a generalisation, a characterisation of the Conservative government over the past 14 years, and overall it concludes that the NHS is in a critical state. Despite this, the report does offer some hope for recovery. It's not all about doom and gloom in its 140 pages. Though the challenges are immense, Starmer is expected to blame the Conservatives for the current state of the NHS, which is what he's been doing for the past 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks. Blaming the Conservatives for everything, cut stuff. He blamed the Conservatives for the current state of the NHS, criticising austerity measures as the coalition government's structural reforms after 2012 and the lack of capital investment during this period. He will present two options: either raise taxes, which he says he's unwilling to do, or reform and modernise the NHS with a 10-year strategy that Labour is developing. The reality is, however, that reform alone won't fix the NHS. It needs a significant injection of funding. Whilst restructuring might help reallocate resources, the NHS urgently requires more capital to retain staff, update its systems and improve services. Issues like crumbling buildings and outdated machinery are the direct result of years of underfunding, which stems from political decisions by the Conservatives that deprioritise investment in the health service in the first place. Staff morale is another critical issue. Exhausted and disengaged workers are leaving the NHS, many moving abroad to places like Australia and Canada. Pay freezes and disputes with unions have contributed to this exodus, as the Conservatives have focused more on the ideological battles than supporting frontline workers. Austerity too, a particular Cameron measure, has been a significant factor in the decline of the NHS. This was a political choice made by the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition in 2010, not an economic necessity. By cutting funding to public services, they aim to shrink the role of the government, leading to a diminished NHS and forcing more people into the private sector. If Labour is serious about restoring the NHS, they will need to raise taxes or borrow to provide the necessary funding. A key part of the solution will also include redirecting resources from the private sector back into the public health services, as Jeremy Corbyn has outlined. As the current trend of privatisation is draining vital funds away from the NHS. I believe Jeremy Corbyn labelled it as £10 million a week was being redirected to private profits. But let me know what you think in the comments. I've been Jake from Just Jake. As always, make love, not war, because we've probably got more room to have your babies than keep you as you're dying on a hospital bed because we haven't got any. You actually made it to the end of the video. If you would like to subscribe to the channel, which, why haven't you already, is somewhere over there. And also, if you want to watch more videos, also check out over there. I've been Jake from Just Jake. See you later.